Hello everyone, welcome to this wonderful panel session. We've gathered some great people from around the corners of the globe for you, and we can grill them with interesting questions. But first, we're just going to give them a chance to introduce themselves. I'm going to be posting links to the bios in the chat as well. So maybe we could start with Paul Wilson.
All right. Good morning, everybody. I'm Paul Wilson. I'm a professor of nuclear engineering at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and have been working on open source software for fusion for about 30 years, all in the realm of fusion neutronics, activation analysis, and things like that. It goes back to ALARA, which was the project for my PhD. And since then, things like PyNE and DAGMC and some contributions to OpenMC. And the newest project is something called ParaStell, which, inspired by John's ParaMech tool, is a tool for building medium fidelity models of stellarator blanket systems. So I'm happy to be here and look forward to answering questions.
Amazing. Thank you, Paul. Could we hear from Aidan next?
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Aidan Fowler. I'm the Copyright Programs Associate at MIT's Technology Licensing Office. My main focus is software licensing, and I head up and am the team for our entire open source program. So I work across the university with varying departments, help with both open source release and support, as well as non-open source software and software licensing. But yeah, excited to answer questions.
Super. Could we hear from Matthew next, please?
Yeah, I'm Matt Vernacchia. I manage the scientific software team at Commonwealth Fusion Systems. Commonwealth Fusion Systems is working on building tokamaks with HTS magnets. We're running a superconducting magnet factory and assembling the Spark tokamak in Massachusetts right now. And our scientific software team supports that effort by building design, modeling, simulation, and data analysis software to help engineers in the company understand and build magnets and tokamaks. And we have a few of those projects open source, such as an electromagnetics calculation library and a tokamak popcorn library.
Super. Could we hear from Martin next, please?
Yeah, John. So I'm Martin Yagi. I'm the IP manager at First Light Fusion. So that's the fusion angle, I guess, as to why I'm on the panel. But I also deal with our open source compliance activities and have a background in that from Cisco and Vodafone, and do quite a lot of compliance related evangelism and education that's made open source, so freely available for everybody. So that's how I get into the open source part.
Super. And David, could we hear from you, please?
Yeah, hi, I'm David Bernholt from Oak Ridge National Laboratory. I'm a computer science researcher, and my primary interests are in programming models and software engineering, and I enjoy working with computational science and engineering applications, and I've been working with the Fusion community for about 20 years now, various projects, and I'm connected to various products, and all of which I think are open source. So Sophie Blondell gave a poster in the previous session about code called Cholodal, which I was involved with, and I gave a poster on the integrated plasma simulator framework, component framework, just a couple of examples. And so I'm a longtime advocate for open source software and try to guide projects to open source their code and also to do good software engineering techniques.
Amazing. That's everyone. And their bios are all in the chat now, so you can have a good look at more detail.
And how about you, John?
I just host panel sessions badly. It's my specialty.
Fair enough.
So, what about this? I start with a question, because because I think the audience is keen to use the Q&A section to ask their questions, but I don't see anything in there yet. So in the meantime, if each of you could give, and you're only allowed to give one example of this, you have to pick your favorite child. No, not your favorite child. You have to pick your favorite single open source project. Only one allowed, and you're allowed to give a little explainer of why you think this is a great example of open source. Let's just have a free for all. Who's a shout out first?
Well, I'll go first, so nobody takes my idea. Right, so it's Paul Wilson. My favorite open source project is probably OpenMC, and there's a number of reasons for it. Probably most importantly in the world that I work in is the fact that it's a high quality tool that is not export controlled. Having developed and taught a course to our undergraduates and our graduate students for many years, relying on MCMP and some of the challenges of getting students access to MCMP, that was always a concern. And now as we do our research, it's made it easier and easier for me to be more open to graduate students from around the world, because I don't have to worry that they may or may not be given access to MCMP. And the last thing, kind of cheat on John's instructions, the fact that the DAGMC tool that we developed here is a first-class part of OpenMC is also really valuable. It was never possible to distribute MCMP with that included because of their distribution limitations. And the fact that OpenMC can be distributed with it means it creates a huge access to one of the things that we've contributed to the community as well. So those are my reasons for picking OpenMC, with shout outs to those in the audience. So.
Well, we know why you're on the panel. OpenMC is great. Do we have any other volunteers? Matthew, maybe?
Yeah, I'll take an example from outside of Fusion, from the Python community more broadly. We find Python's a really great language to use for our projects that we want to get engineers and physicists who don't come from a software background up to speed on quickly. And we found that the developer tools for Python that Astral has come out with, the UV package manager and the rough linter, have been really good for making it easier for new contributors to a Python project to get Python installed in their system, get all the dependencies in a very easy, low frustration way, and then also get up to speed on writing high quality Python code with the rough linter that helps them comply with the latest style best practices. And both of those tools also run extremely fast compared to the options that were out there previously, and that reducing the feedback cycle time for developers is really important as well.
Just have to shout out that it only took 7 minutes for someone to mention Rust, and it wasn't John. So
Rust is the best. Right, don't distract me, Paul. So we've still got a few people. We've got David and Aidan and Martin. Any volunteers for your favorite open source package? People will just hate you if you don't say their package.
Well, probably everybody's going to hate me. I'm going to go with another example from outside the Fusion community. The LLVM compiler suite, I think, is a really interesting exemplar. It's something that has an extremely large community around it, contributing to it, as well as using it. There are both open source and proprietary versions. Many vendors use it as a basis for their proprietary compilers. And so there's a fair amount of diversity, but there's also a lot of people contributing to this same enormous code base and sharing their code. So it's really, to me, kind of an exemplar of what we might want to strive for. Even, many communities can't reasonably be that large, but there's a lot of flexibility and a lot of interesting things going on in the LLVM community. It's also a great research tool for a lot of compiler researchers.
Yeah, you're getting some support in the chat there, David. Good choice. I think Rust uses LVM, so it must be good.
So I'll jump in then. I was going to, before anybody else takes my idea, I was going to go for Mozilla, partly because, that was the starting point of the Mozilla Foundation and Firefox and stuff like that, and just the whole kind of ethos and stuff behind them, I think kind of pretty much encapsulates open source and everything that it's about. So that's what I go for.
Thank you, Martin. Great choice. Mozilla are in the news at the moment for not all good things, but they've been doing good things up to now, I think. We've got one more. Am I right, Aidan? Is it?
Yeah. So outside the fusion space and being from MIT, there's a project called Moose IVP, and I really enjoy it. It's one of those baseline projects that the sheer number of projects built on top of it is enormous, and it's expanded as a community, but the initial package that was developed is still being run by a small team, just keeping it running, trying to figure out sort of over time how they're going to pass it on, keep it moving, but always like that comic of the one Lego piece holding up the skyscraper of a small developer in the middle of nowhere. So I really enjoy the small projects supporting everything above them.
Is that the Ph.D. comic? With one random developer in, yes, everyone's standing on the shoulders of that giant. Okay, I am going to open the floor. So the first person to put a question, whatever it is, in the Q&A section, gets their question asked. Oh gosh, that was quick. Oh, it got deleted. No, it got answered. I think I see the questions before the rest of people. Sorry about this. Okay, this is a nice question. Are there panelists happy with the usage of open source software in their respective compared to the usage of software? I think the question is IP with the amount of the percentage software usage in your field. What do you think? There's too much source software?
You're breaking up a bit, John, but I think we get the gist, right? I'm not going to go first in every question, but I'll say that I'm generally pretty happy. I think in the fusion neutronics space, there's been a lot of growth into open source. There's still some, I would say, anxiety about moving away from some of the traditional tools because of their relationship to regulatory space primarily, the long validation history they may have, but I see a real shift there, and so I'm generally pretty happy with it. I do file, I am always eager to try and push against some of the reluctance, but in the biggest sense, I think there's, what I'm seeing is more and more adoption of these tools and moving in the right way.
I would agree. I'm pretty happy. I mean, my field's all over the place, but the push towards more open source release is leading to further development on projects, which I think would have died otherwise. And these developments over time can really open up the usability of a different package, whether it's more efficient within its own field or can be expanded outwards. So I am very excited by how much more is being released under open source licensing nowadays, but I think increasing the understanding of what is truly open source and what is not open source is something that needs to be more clearly explained, because there are a lot of packages out there labeled as open source which do not fit within the definition.
Yeah, I think I'm pretty happy or comfortable in terms of open source coming in and being used or even going out, as long as basically the correct procedures and policies are followed in order to do so. I always feel like I'm the person that says no, but I'm trying to be not the person who says no. I'm the person who's trying to say, if like this, then yes. If like that, then no. We'll avoid that and just make sure we have the correct kind of checks and balances, and then generally be good to go and be encouraged to do so.
Remy has kindly shared his hotspot. Hopefully that connection's better. Shall we move on to the next question? I hear yes. Okay, what in your opinion is the biggest hurdle to open source software adoption in the Fusion community? Yes, I'm gonna put these answers are appearing in the Q&A as well, so other people can type responses as well. But let's hear some answers from our panel. What's the biggest hurdle to open source adoption?
I think from what I often see, it's a feeling that people need to protect the IP embodied in the code, and that the best way for them to do that is to not share it. There are plenty of arguments for open sourcing code, and that one can be hard to counter sometimes with some people, but that's, to me, the biggest obstacle I often see.
Thank you.
I think the biggest hurdles to adopting code that already is open source is code quality and documentation, and ways to make that sustainable and transparent and visible. And so I would encourage projects to invest in their developer tooling. That makes it easy for someone evaluating the project to see, like, yes, this has a test suite, it's run on every commit to main, it's passing, I feel confident using this. It makes it easy to see, okay, if I need to contribute back to this project, there's guidelines on how to do that are clearly written. There's tools to help me make sure that my contributions are like up to the standards of code quality and code review that this project expects. And if I want to install it, it's on a package manager, and I can like easily bring it into my dependency management system. I think like seeing projects that check all of those boxes makes it much easier for us to adopt open source work in our own projects.
I'll take that as a segue. I think on the supplier side, the challenge is having the funding to do all of those things. I think, everyone who has an open source software project that really wants to see it more widely used would love to do those things. And in my world, many of them grow out of research efforts where the funding agencies aren't really interested in funding those things. They want to fund the fancy new algorithms and the fancy new capabilities, but there isn't a lot of interest in funding that infrastructure support. And so, maybe, I guess, a question or a thought I'll throw out there from the consumers of these tools. One of the advantages of open source software is it's free. One of the challenges of open source software is if it's free, there's not a good revenue stream to try and do all of the fancy things that Matt just said we need to do, which are super important. I want to do them. I'd love to do them. I scrape together some hours here and there to try and do some of them, but I think it's a bit of a disconnect that exists out there.
Yeah, and one thing that's kind of addressing that is I was really excited to see the Plasma Fair folks at this conference and like learn about them from that. And their service of like going and getting grants to be able to improve software quality across the plasma science space, and then offering like software quality consulting services to open source projects. I don't think that's a complete solution, but like maybe that's one piece towards helping what Paul was talking about.
Yeah, I think in terms of adoption, I don't see.
I hear those points, and especially what Paul was saying. I know Paul has maintained some code bases for decades, and it's definitely difficult to sustain funding after projects end. There is a great question in the chat which I'm dying to ask. Are there any limits to what could or should be open sourced? Thank you, Baptiste. Now, who haven't we heard from recently? Any takers on that one?
I mean, I'll add from a non-fusion perspective that, again, outside of anything to do with legality and export control, I'm a big proponent of releasing what you can and what you want to open source and really minimizing any sort of bottleneck to release. But I also, with that, like to make sure that everything has been reviewed instead of something just being thrown up on GitHub without being looked at all. So I'm a big proponent of getting as much out there as possible within the law, and that won't get individual developers or your institution as a whole in any sort of compliance trouble.
I think that varies around the world. So you might write a code that you can't release if you're in America, but if you wrote it in another country, it wouldn't necessarily be export controlled. So maybe it's not easy.
So it's interesting your comment about, it should be reviewed or you want, right? So, it raises this question of how do we as a community judge the quality of a code package? There's some obvious indicators, and then there's some gray areas, and then there's obvious indicators on the weak side, obvious indicators on the strong side, and the big gray area in the middle. I'm routinely trying to convince people to open stuff absolutely as early as possible, even if it hasn't seen a lot of review, because the best way to get review, sometimes, if you're a small project, is to open it up and let other people start looking at it and giving you feedback and comments. Now, you have to be willing to take that feedback, and the user community has to be able to judge which things are worth using and which things aren't worth using. But I'm curious, when you say what you're imagining in that process.
Yeah, so I guess what I'm imagining is less sort of QC, QA all on the code base and seeing if it's a functional project. I fully agree that I feel like the best way to do that is to put it out into the community, see use, see development, and move from there. The main sort of review I'm talking about would be any sort of third-party code dependencies, or in certain cases, sponsored research behind it to make sure not only is the code in at least a quality that releasing it isn't negligent, but in the sense that you're also not taking other developers' code or proprietary code and utilizing it in a way that will actually get your code pulled and or possibly get someone in trouble.
Super. I see a question in the chat which has got a lot of thumbs up, and it's from Remy, so we kind of have to ask this one as well. Or he switches off the whole of gather.town, I guess. So Remy has been told recently at an international meeting that if he makes his codes open source with a permissive MIT license, that one day it's inevitable that a private company will fork it, make a copy, and start selling it with a paid license, and then somehow also forbid users from using the free version. So Rem is asking us to debunk this theory. Has anyone ever seen anyone fork a project, change a license, and sell it commercially?
So I can speak specifically to the MIT license because that's the one I'm the most familiar with. So the MIT license does allow someone to fork your project, make a private fork of it, and then start selling that. If you don't want that to happen, there are other licenses that you could choose instead. However, even in that case, you are still allowed to keep using and developing the original version of it. You are still the creator and the IP owner of that original project. And the MIT license is essentially you just saying, hey, I'm going to, for $0 to anyone who wants it, sell you a ticket to use this code yourself.
Yeah, so I'll add to that. That's, I think, generally true of any permissive license, that it's possible that somebody could take it private. And this is a concern that I often hear when I talk to people about open sourcing code. And it's legitimate at some level, but I will say in my experience of 30 plus years in computational science, I see this happening very, very little. And I don't think it's a practical concern for most people.
Yeah, I think it's a potential concern. People could certainly do that,
Okay.
and then I think
Fair enough. Sounds like it doesn't happen very much. It could theoretically happen,
John,
but not the art.
John,
I think you cut Martin here. He was
yeah.
in the middle of something.
Sorry.
Sorry, yeah, I was going to say that, yeah, theoretically that sort of thing could happen, and it's not necessarily a bad thing if that commercial company is actually putting a lot of added value of its own code. Then that's fine if people are willing to pay for it, but they can still go back to the free MIT license version, and you'll actually see if there are lots of people who don't want to pay for that commercial version, that you'll probably see a load of activity go back into that MIT version, and that one under the permissive license will start moving forward. And we've seen that kind of thing happen where companies with their own project have gone from a permissive license to something a bit more business license or source available license, that big companies that were using those have stepped in and basically made their own fork under a permissive license. So whilst it could happen, it's just down to kind of normal economics, and that does not mean that you've killed the original intent or life of the original open source project. So I would not be that concerned about it.
I'll just add quickly, and I'll have to find the actual source because I've only heard about it third hand, but I heard about a recent study that was talking about intellectual property broadly, and showed that very, very little of the intellectual property that's coming from universities actually results in substantial commercial value. And we spend a lot of time worrying about protecting this IP, and the resources we invest in protecting it, may be disproportionate to the actual opportunity that's out there. So I've always been an advocate for permissive licenses, and I think that it's threading the needle for the number of times that something like this is going to happen. And it still, as everyone said, it still doesn't prevent you from using the free version.
Super.
Another point on that is that open source can be a form of defensive publication, so that if you've had an idea and you then open source that idea idea being publicly available establishes prior art that then prevents someone else from going and patenting that idea and then preventing you from selling it.
Yeah, good point. Good point. I just jumped on Roma's computer because this one seems to work. It's Windows based and not Linux. Right. There's lots of people in the audience who are thinking I should go make my own open source package right now, and I suppose that's maybe some of the reasons people are here. Could you give one piece of advice to someone who hasn't started yet? They're just about to make that GitHub repo that solves fusion.
I'm not sure the nature of your question.
Sorry, that's not very clear. Yeah, I think I'm looking for advice like, what's the one most important thing they should do when they make a repo? And they're planning to open source this. What should they do on day one to make it as good as possible? Where should they focus their efforts? Apart from writing Rust, of course.
Make sure that there's a license file or a very clear license indication, and keep license headers and the like and copyright headers on all the files, because you'll be making the life easier for anybody who's consuming it in the future.
Martin, I've never understood the license headers on files. Do we need them if we have a license file itself?
Not necessarily, no, but it just helps the traceability. And also if somebody else takes just one of those files from your particular project, then that means that it's still there and everybody understands. But you're right, having the file in the top level and so that it turns up in GitHub and everyone can see it, then that's probably the most important thing. But I would still recommend having a header on each file just in case. Open source projects borrow from each other all of the time at different levels, and it's probably best to keep it, and it just keeps it clean and clear. And you could even use a single line SPDX header, which just kind of codes the license in one, and that can be then covered by tooling as well.
Thank you.
I would definitely agree, and that please do put a license on your code before you publish it. We have issues constantly of just pieces of software up there with nothing on it, and the chance of someone thinking they can take your code and do whatever they want with it is going to be much higher if you don't have a license up there, just based on understanding. I would also say for anyone starting an open source project, make comments, keep notes, be careful with version control. You may have a project you're working on now that's pretty introductory, but say, I don't know, a year down the line, you've developed it to the point of a commercial product, but you can't prove what's been released is under this license or not. So just making sure going forward, you have some form of record to identify sort of when you're starting these things. If you're trying to separate a version from a version, really set a hard line there, because when it comes to where the actual license is applicable, it doesn't necessarily have to be on the entire project. It can be on the first thing you release, and it doesn't mean the rest has to be open source. But like in everything, keep good records, make comments. It's easier for all of us in the future.
I'd say invest in developer tooling early on. So linters, tests, package manager, that'll make it easy for you to move fast by having the computer catch your mistakes for you. And it'll also make it easier for other people, if they want to jump in and start contributing. And Plasma Fair actually has a guide for specifically how to do this for scientific projects in Python, which I'll drop in the chat.
Yeah, I think all of that infrastructure, I work with students all the time, and they always want to run and start writing code, and I tell them, what about your tests? And sometimes I have the authority to make them write tests, and sometimes it seems like it's just sort of experimental and they don't write tests. And then inevitably, every single time they don't start doing testing soon enough, it comes back to bite them. And so, I think testing is really critical. And then developing the infrastructure to automate that for your potential contributors. I think there's some infrastructure you can and it's interesting, I have to see what the Plasma Fair people say about this. It's interesting to kind of figure out the right timing for some of the other infrastructure. Things like templates for issues and pull requests. Probably it's premature to do that in a brand new project because, you're not quite sure what should be in an issue or pull request yet. And it seems like a bunch of effort to invest in something that nobody knows about yet. But, remember those things are there. So as the project is developing, and if you start to get broader participation, remember that those are tools that can really help things move along as well.
I want to suggest that people think first carefully about whether they want to or need to go on their own, or whether there is some larger, better known package that they could contribute to accomplish their goals. Oftentimes, the larger package is at a better level in terms of the software engineering considerations, and you're likely to get more visibility if you contribute to something that's larger, has a larger contributor base and a larger audience. And so there's, this idea that we all have these research ideas and we want to let a million flowers bloom, but oftentimes from a maintenance standpoint, a million is too many, and we can't really afford to keep all these things going. And if you're part of something larger, I think there's a better chance that it can be sustained for longer.
You hear that, John? That segues into one of the other questions that's here, and I think it's one that does, that I spend a lot of time trying to figure out what the right balance is whether, people should be contributing to existing projects or starting their own project. And, the challenge I think that a lot of people experience is existing products have some sort of baggage that they're not fond of. And so they think it's, and the open source world and entrepreneurism sort of encourages people to plant that millionth flower, but it definitely does fragment the community in a way that I think if we could have all of that resource or in smaller numbers of tools, have the resource be concentrated, it would really help. And we talk about all the difficulty we have in supporting and maintaining these packages. One of the reasons that there's so much difficulty is that fragmentation.
Yes, that sounds familiar. Lived experiences. There's maybe this Stefan's question connects to that a little bit. Can we expect that pull requests to big projects will be regarded in a similar way to publications? So maybe at the moment, sort of all the glory is in making your own package and becoming famous, whereas maybe we need to value pull requests and contributions to existing packages more in a similar way to publications. Has anyone seen anyone turn a pull request into a publication or got any experience on that?
Well, it's worth pointing out that there are publication venues for software these days, and probably the most relevant one to this community is the Journal of Open Source Software. So you are actually publishing, it's a little bit of information you have to provide, but essentially you're publishing the software, gets a DOI and things like that, and there's a review process and all. And so that's essentially publishing the software per se. There are a couple of other venues like that. But the other thing I wanted to mention, I don't know to what extent this community is aware, but there's a sort of career track that has been developing around the world for about the last 10, 12 years called research software engineering, which is, it may or may not be a job title at a lot of institutions, but there are people all over the place in this role. And they have a lot of experience with how to get evaluation and performance appraisals and things like that to be based more on the software contributions, like pull requests and reviews of pull requests and things like that. So that may be a community that people would be interested in joining and be looking to for experience with these kind of issues.
Yeah, I think there's an inherent challenge that, and I'll think from my own experience that some of the most important pull requests as a project is growing are the kind of maintenance support that aren't the kinds of things that are going to be as seen as valuable as publications. If you were to contribute a major new feature to an open source piece of software, in most cases there could be a publication that would go along with it anyways. But if you're contributing a major upgrade to continuous integration testing, using well-known practices from around the software engineering community just to make a particular project better, it's hard for that to be, it's super valuable, but it's hard for that kind of contribution to be, it doesn't have the same kind of novelty that, generally speaking, if you're talking about publications, there's a novelty aspect that's assumed. And so bringing best practices into another project doesn't bring the same sort of novelty, unfortunately. And so it's difficult to imagine how, I think the research software engineering track and from an individual, maybe it's not going to count like a publication, but maybe within a given role at an institution, it will still count towards you being good at your job.
We just have a few minutes left, a couple of minutes left. So maybe, does anyone on the panel have anything that they've been bursting to say, but they've had bad questions and they've not had a chance to get out what they want to say? Anyone been a bit unusually quiet? Just a couple of minutes. Maybe we have time for one.
I haven't been unusually quiet, but I'll jump in anyways, because I'm looking at some of these questions.
Yes.
And an idea has occurred to me inspired by some of the questions, because one of the challenges is this whole support mechanism. And it makes me wonder whether, and I could imagine, for example, I have imagined setting up a company that could sell support for free software. And that's one of the models for generating revenue and generating support. But that's a whole bunch of work that I don't necessarily want to do personally. And I'm not necessarily that kind of entrepreneurial person. But I wonder within the Fusion community, there could be an organization, in the US context, it could be a nonprofit, maybe not, but an organization that could be a clearinghouse where users could have one organization they interact with to enter into some sort of support agreement, and that organization would then dole out funds to individual software packages. There was something that one of my colleagues and staff members did something like this. I don't remember the name of the company, but it was sort of a broader, not Fusion relevant. It was sort of broad, providing an access to supported tools for financial Python kind of purposes and things like that. So, it's not my own idea because I've sort of weaved it together from some of the questions that are coming in here, but it's an interesting concept and it would require somebody to take the initiative that's other than me, but.
I think we're going to have to end it there. There are still open questions in the Q&A. If any of the panel members have got time to click on answer these questions, that would be great. But otherwise, I think we'll have to close down because there's another talk happening in room 1, Plasma Pi project. So thank you very much to our panelists. Sorry for my terrible connections, and hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.